How do we graph an absolute value function, such as f of x is equal to absolute value of x? Well, what does absolute value mean? Absolute value is the distance between a number and 0. So if I have the absolute value of negative 5, this is equal to positive 5 because the distance between 0 and negative 5, it's a distance, so it's positive 5. The absolute value of positive 5 is positive 5. The distance between 0 and positive 5 is positive 5. The distance is always positive. So anything that you put into an absolute value, what's going to come out of that will be a positive number. So if I look at y equals absolute value of x and I want to graph this, but I don't know how, but I do know that y equals x looks like this. It's a straight line that goes right through the origin with a slope of 1. These look pretty similar. The only difference is I have the absolute value in x. Well, we just decided that, or we just confirmed that absolute value of x means that every number that comes out will be positive. So all my y values are positive. But over here, I have some negative y values. All that's going to happen is they're going to be flipped over, and they're going to become positive. So y equals absolute value of x looks like this. It's kind of like a V with two lines that are mirror images, because I had this graph over here, but everything was flipped over the axis because I cannot have negative y values for this graph. So this is what an absolute value graph looks like. And just like a quadratic, a cubic, or square root, or whatever graph, you can move it around, change the shape a little bit, flip it over. So how do we know what's happening to our graph if there's more than just absolute value of x? Well, if we have absolute value of x plus 1 on the outside, this is increasing every single y value by 1 because of that plus 1. So instead of starting at 0, 0, I'm going to start at 0, 1 because every y value was increased by 1. Now if this was a absolute value of x minus 1, well, that means every y value goes down by 1. So I'm starting at 0, negative 1. So the number on the outside of the absolute value, if it's positive, you're going up. If it's negative, you're going down. How do we move our graph left or right? Let's say I have y equals absolute value of x minus 1. Now, intuitively, we might want to think it's a minus, so I'm going to go to the left. However, the question you need to ask yourself to determine whether you're going left or right is what makes this absolute value, everything inside, equal to 0? And the answer would be x has to be positive 1, which means we're going to the right by 1. There is no shift up or down, so my starting point is going to be 1, 0. If this was a x plus 1 inside an absolute value, you would be going to the left by 1. So it's the opposite of what you would expect. When you're going up or down, it's the same as what you would expect. If it's positive, you're going up. If it's negative, you're going down. But for changing left or right, it's the opposite. So if it's a negative 1, then you're going to go to the right 1. If it's a positive 1, you're going to go to the left 1. What happens if I stick a number in front of my absolute value? Which, by the way, this is the same thing as the absolute value of 10 times x, because 10 is a positive number, so I can take it out of the absolute value. It's always going to be positive. It's not going to affect my answer if I have it inside or in the outside. So what does this graph look like? Well, the shape is what's changing, but the starting point is the same. It's 0, 0. I haven't moved up or down or left or right. The only thing is that my slope is now much higher, so I'm going to have a much steeper line. I'm going up a lot quicker. Now, if this was a 1/2 absolute value of x, then it's going to be a little bit of a wider graph because my values are being cut in half. So my y values are not going to be increasing at the same rate as my x values because slope is rise over run, and if I have a smaller number in my denominator, I'm increasing in my x faster than I am increasing in my y. So that's why my line gets more and more close to the horizontal, whereas if I have, in this case, 10 over 1, I'm increasing my y much faster than I'm increasing my x, so my line gets closer and closer to the vertical. So let's do a couple of examples. Actually, one more thing. What if I have y equals negative in front of the absolute value of x? Well, usually every single value that comes out of my absolute value is going to be positive, but because I have this negative in front of here, I'm going to get the opposite of that. Everything becomes negative. This does not affect my starting point because I do not have a plus or minus in the absolute value or a plus or minus outside of the absolute value. So a negative will change everything and flip it, so I have an upside down V. Let's do a couple of examples. Let's say I have y equals negative absolute value of x plus 2 minus 2. So I notice that there's a negative, which means I'm going to have an upside down v. I also notice there's a shift both horizontally and vertically. So the shift horizontally is to the left 2 because this is a plus 2, and remember it's the opposite of what you would expect, because you want to ask yourself what makes this absolute value equal to 0, and the answer would be when x is equal to negative 2. So I'm going to go left 2, and I also notice I have a negative 2 over here on the outside, which means I'm going to go down 2, and this is going to be the starting point, the tip of my v, and it's going to be an upside down v because of that negative in front of the absolute value. So that's what my graph, a rough sketch, would look like. What if I have y equals absolute value of x minus 4, and it will stick a 4 on the front, plus 2. So I notice that there's a coefficient in front of my absolute value, which all that means it's going to be a little bit steeper. There is no negative, so it's going to be a right side up v, and I have x minus 4, which means I'm not going to the left, I'm going to the right by 4. And I'm going up 2 because of that plus 2 on the outside. And my graph is just a little bit steeper than if there was nothing in front of it. And we'll do one more example. What if I have y equals 1/2 times the absolute value of x minus 6? So there's a 1/2 in front of here, which means my graph it's not going to be upside down because there is no negative. It's a positive coefficient, but it's going to be a little bit wider. The v is going to be a little bit wider. It won't be as steep because 1/2 will reduce all my y values. There is no shift left or right, so I know that I'm going to be on the y-axis. There is a shift down by 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so my starting point is going to be 0, comma, negative 6, and the graph is a little bit wider. And this is just a rough sketch, so the slope might not be exact based on the scale, but if it was to scale, the graph will look a little bit wider than if you just had y equals absolute value of x minus 6.